and the earth did tremble. The summer of 1865 was ending. Every man among us knew that by the color which teased the trees, the nip in the morning air. A thick mist had reared up from some creek or other in the hollers, and the foggy clearing we'd chosen as our resting place was made a blinding panoply of glinting dew by the nascent rays of the dawn. The three of us crouched there at the woodline, breath held, eyes wide, listening. "How long should we wait if he doesn't show, you reckon?" Keith Elder spoke the words, but his dark eyes didn't turn to meet ours. He scanned the vaporous veil from his perch to my right, wary of each fluttering bird or wayward doe whose image broke through the haze, his rifle readied at his side. I waited to see if Roger Kane would save me the trouble, but he too was scouring the meadow, far too occupied to furnish an answer. "I figure we give him another hour," I sighed. "We said dawn, but who knows what kind of catching up he's had to do." Roger nodded his agreement, almost wistful. Still, he looked no more delighted than Keith to be caught in the mist on the hills, his finger twitching on his trigger guard and his thumb tapping out absent-minded rhythms against the stock. I knew exactly why they were so on edge, though I did my best to keep any discomfort I might have felt buried deep down beneath the surface. We'd only just entered Kentucky the day prior after the months-long off-road walk north from Atlanta, skulking past civilization in an attempt to get home on our own 2 feet without meeting the Federals, which had crawled here and there across Tennessee and the Carolinas. Most of those who'd worn the gray had been fairly treated, and only a few would face the noose or the irons. A small consolation to keep them passive, we were sure. But there was no such guarantee back home. Kentucky had never left the Union. Those of us who went south with the Orphan Brigade in '61 were apprehensive about trusting we'd be welcomed back, for there wasn't any official Reconstruction or occupation delegation in Kentucky, only the vindictive Loyalist governor, eager to prove his worth to the Federals. The Kentucky legislature had gone and made volunteering with the Confederates a felony in '62, or so we'd heard, and there'd been talk all through the final months of the war about what we could expect upon returning home. That was only the half of it, however. The Orphan Brigade had been over 4,000 altogether when we set out, and by the time of surrender we counted no more than 700. There were many staggering losses in many far-flung fields for the orphans, but we 3 were 4th Infantrymen, and that meant our worst had been at Shiloh. Though Shiloh had been an April morning, and though western Tennessee's low-rolling hills had been tame compared to the Appalachian tangle that now surrounded us, the mist and the hush were identical. In those quiet moments, looking out across the meadow, it was as if we were back down in the thick of it, surrounded by fog freshly rolled off the Tennessee River, waiting on the whistle's call for advance. I almost riddled Frederick when he did finally come back. I'm sure it was much the same with the others, all 3 of us jumpy with anticipation, half expecting some Maine or Ohio man to come stumbling out of the vapor and blue. Fred told us he'd been welcomed onto his property with open arms, and that it seemed his family had managed to keep his absence played down. Others in eastern Kentucky hadn't proved so fortunate, though. His young wife told they'd seized the estates of 2 miners over in Pikeville, and dragged one off to a cell when he wound his way back home. He told us of Lincoln's assassination a full 3 months before, lost on us as we'd skulked down woodland routes and camped in secret beyond the prying eyes of towns. We could only swap words for so long before the reality of the situation set in, and Fred made to go. Frederick made us recite the old pledge we'd given to write, and we all clasped his hand in turn. We were glad to see him home, to see the smile light his lean face when he talked of reaching the house in which he'd grown up, But we weren't warm about losing him after so long. There'd been a sense of belonging with the orphans, the kind of purposeful familiarity that grates on you right up until the moment you don't have it anymore. That belonging had been withering away all through the march north. It didn't help that our own fates were far less certain, leaving us to look after Fred long after he'd bobbed away into the mists. The morning dragged as we dreaded another day on our worn boots over rough ground, but eventually I spurred us into motion. We followed an old northward route snaking through the valleys between the dense mountains, always careful to stay far from the dirt roads through the trees. Occasionally, a man leading goats or swine down the way would pass, barely visible through the scrub, but we never got spotted. We kept up an admirable pace through the forested hills, and by the evening we rolled out blankets to sleep beneath the crisp air and the colorful canopy, each man hoping beyond hope that the weather would stay pleasant through the night. No fire, as usual, as much a precaution against curious black bears as wandering locals. I didn't know the area well, being an Ashland man from further north, but as we ended the night's walk, Keith insisted he knew of the valley in which we lay and plotted out the route we'd take to reach Owingsville. He and Roger were both from the region, and though Owingsville was a good 3 days off along the winding woodland path we followed with only a few scattered homesteads in between, they supposed we could take a faster route and carve a day off the travel. Neither had taken this particular pass before, only heard tell of the place from family in the region who'd mentioned moving logs along the creek there when they raised a house years ago. They both seemed fairly sure this was the place we'd fork off east if we wanted to take it, though. I wasn't in a state to push back, given how much my legs ached after far too long on my feet. The cut through the eastern hills was decided upon, and we all turned in for an early sleep. That was the first night something was off. None of us would mention it until later, when it took on a malign weight in light of what we'd come to know. I took it to be a dream, then, some trick of the mind played just as I stirred from sleep in the darkest depths of the night. A couple hours past midnight, there came, faint but unmistakable, a stifled shudder from the cool earth. It was no more than a shiver, like the sensation of feet passing over an old wooden floor at your side, save the whole forest was hushed, its intrepid silence broken only by the distant echoes of birds warming up before the dawn. I only noticed this sensation at all because my hand, slung upon my chest in the night, shook and wavered as I opened my eyes, the sensation dying away beneath me the second I bothered to heed it. I rolled onto my side, back sore after countless nights on the ground, and shrugged it off. I supposed the others did the same, haggard and desperate for a few more hours of sleep. We'd come to regret it before long. The clattering of cookware and the refilling of water skins gave way to our planned march through the hills, and the terrain got rougher as we moved further from the road. At first, I was relieved at the privacy, my steps falling heavier on the crackling brush as we moved along the creek beds and shaded vales of the hollers. As the trees grew thicker and the terrain steeper, I fast came to realize we were in an unplumbed region, wild by comparison even to the remotest ravines of my rural home up in Ashland. Mountains were close set and gnawed by streams that left their flanks rocky and jagged near the valley floors. Boulders molded by time into fangs stuck up through briars amidst the trees, making each footfall a cautious affair bent on avoiding a sprain. Mist plumed from the canopied ponds and valley streams like smoke, wreathing the sky beyond the interwoven trees with low clouds that smothered the noonday gleam. The slow creek was thick with grime and cloudy mold, making us glad we'd filled our skins the day prior. We were men of the hills, but these were far rougher than our own had been, and none of us sat comfortably when we broke for lunch 10 miles into the walk, much less when we settled in for sleep in a stifled glen around sundown, a spot so secluded we figured a fire was in order. We reminisced about marches through Tennessee and Alabama, but the atmosphere was dark. It would be wrong to call the glen in which we bedded down silent. That word doesn't have enough strength to it. Strangled might be a better way to put it. Even then, it doesn't capture the way the nearby stream's slow gurgle reverberated off the twisted treetops and bounded off the naked stone of the boulders amidst which we slept. Every spoken word was a shield against a discomfort we didn't dare put to one another while sat there amidst the shadow. But those words came cheap, and we spent more time gazing on the firelit boulders than upon each other. I'd have done well to listen to my initial impulse and try and withdraw. I imagined packing up and stumbling back south out of the ravines in the night a few times as I lay there struggling for sleep. I couldn't imagine it was any different for the rest of us, but sleep found us eventually. With it came the trembling. This was not like the first. The jolt came around the same time, I wager, but that's all the similarity I can ascribe to it. This was a shaking, a muffled earthquake playing out beneath the soil. It was undeniable now, shaking tree limbs overhead and sending colored leaves down in drifts to litter the forest floor. I looked to Roger and Keith, but I found no surety in their eyes. They were as startled as I. We rose into crouches, eyes upward in case of falling trees, clustered around the dead embers of the fire, waiting. The trembling lasted only 20 or 30 seconds, but we sat up the remainder of the night, unsure of whether the quake had truly passed. We reckoned these might have been a rekindling of the kind of quakes our grandparents said rattled the mountains 50 years back, speculated about how bad the damage must be out west in the low country near Bowling Green, where the fault line loomed nearer. It was only then we came to mention we'd all felt that almost imperceptible shaking the night before, remarking on how strange it was that it had come around the same hour. By the time morning's tentative light crept down into the valleys, we'd gotten over our nerves. A bit sleepless after an interrupted night, but that was nothing new to the three of us. We broke what little camp we'd made and walked on, ankles sore but hearts soaring with the knowledge we were close to home, far away as it might seem in the cramped woodland that leaned in around us. We tried to keep spirits high. We spoke of family, of comforts we'd missed on campaign. Not one of us spoke of the campaigns themselves, though. There was a feeling in the pit of each man's stomach, I believe, though I can only speak directly to what I felt as we wound closer to home and further from Georgia, and the lives we'd left behind there. It was, to me, as if I were an old man, beyond my years, being shepherded out of a theater, treated to one last spectacular show before my days drew to a close. Much as I tried not to let my mind linger on Shiloh or any one of a dozen entanglements, much as I tried to remind myself of the horror, the loss, those dark days had wrought, I couldn't lay them aside. War is terrible, true, but it's also energy incarnate. A man becomes an ant amidst his colony, a breathing part of titanic historical forces he can't truly grasp, shoulder to shoulder with 1,000 others willing to give life and limb for the cause, or to stop such a cause. Such a man will never come close to recreating that sense of purpose, that unspoken bond with so many others who stepped up to join him, in all his time under the sun after the cannons fall quiet and he slinks back to his home. It was not guilt we felt, I'd contend, though I'm sure that played its role. No, ours was the slow, agonizing realization that all that mattered in our Kentuckian lives paled in comparison to what we'd done with the Orphan Brigade in the wake of '61. We might live on for decades, eking out dozens of years in comfort in a house on a hill, rearing children and grandchildren with the fruits of our labor. But for all that, we'd be walking corpses, our purpose spent. Nothing would ever be so vital, so important, so worthy, ever again. That feeling had been buried in each of us all through the walk, but the eerie cast of the region all round us and the nervous tension that seemed to keep the woods so quiet left us to gnaw our own innards to pieces all through that second day in the passes. With each dour, overcast veil through which we passed, our own hopelessness deepened, and our conversation grew more and more sparse. By nightfall, when we gathered at the banks of the dirty creek and made to rest, I felt more exhausted than I felt in all my life, far more exhausted than a trek through rugged terrain ever warranted. It was easy to find sleep, tired as we were. Even our dark environs didn't dull our need for rest. That didn't mean our slumber was deep. When the familiar trembling came again in the depths of the night, harder than ever, I rolled up into a crouch at once, rifle in hand. Seeing Roger do much the same across the way, I frantically scanned for Keith Elder, finding his spot at the long-dead fireside empty. It was only seconds later that Keith scrambled back up the embankment into view, shirtless and soaked with greasy water, as if he'd been bathing in the grimy creek. The trimmers played themselves out, felling an old dead tree in the forest in the process, before receding as they'd done the night before. Telling us he'd been fetching water from the creek, Keith made to dry off and reclaim what sleep he could before morning, and we didn't feel the need to question him. When we woke at dawn to find him crouched over the water's edge, he suggested he might have a touch of dysentery, and laughed about how much drinking he'd done over the course of the night. Again, Roger and I didn't think much of it, and we set off after Keith the moment it was light enough to navigate the tangled undergrowth. I might have thought it odd that we didn't see him stop to move his bowels once over the course of the day, but it was a fleeting thing, buried beneath my feelings of meandering purposelessness which were fattened on the dark forest smothering the vales. This, I think, is where it began, for us at least. Keith knew something more than he let on about the eastern passes before we ever set foot in them. It had, after all, been his idea to take them. But when, in time, we came to our third resting place in the passes and decided, in light of the aftershocks we assumed were playing themselves out in the mountains, to make camp in a small meadow clear of falling trees, Keith became more and more the object of fear in our eyes, outweighing the gnarled manse of trees all round us. First, he protested that we'd be 100 yards or more from the creek which ran down the valley. Then, realizing we wouldn't risk the trees in the night lest another quake rear up in the dark and topple a log on us, he fidgeted and paced the evening away, dismissing himself no less than 9 times over the course of 2 hours to walk down to the banks for water and privacy. Roger, whose ears survived the thunder of massed powder more intact than mine, would swear he heard Keith talking to himself in the trees, but we never properly caught him doing it when we'd go to check on him. He'd just wave us away, tell us to leave a sick man what privacy he was owed, that sort of act. We were starting to take it as just that, though, an act. There was something off about our friend, we muttered amongst ourselves, something that went beyond the silence and the dejection of defeat. During one of Keith's last trips into the trees before we settled in for sleep, Roger agreed to mimic sleep for the first few hours of the night, nudge me awake, then let me take the remainder, that we might keep an eye on Keith without alerting him to our observations. The stress of the journey, and all that had come before, must be getting to him, or so we figured. Just before we turned in, seated around the fire with Keith shuddering and fidgeting in the flickering light, Roger made to break the silence, I think to lighten the leaden atmosphere that had fallen over the 3 of us. He said he thought we must be close to the other end of the passes, where the mountains would fall back and leave us room to breathe as we closed in on Owingsville. "We'll have to see whether these quakes we keep feeling reach further than the passes," he said, nodding northwards through the darkness. "We should be out of Ezra's Crag by this time tomorrow, maybe even within sight of home." My stomach dropped. That was the first time either of them had used that name, had given a title to the little dip in the mountains through which we'd weaved for the past few days. Whatever ill fortune had let that name slip by unsaid all through our discussions on taking the eastward route through the passes had done me more harm than any blundered order or bayonet wound. Why hadn't I thought to put that name together with this blasted place until then? My granddad's favorite eerie tale to tell us when we were young was of Ezra's Crag, of how he and his brothers had been hired to drive a small herd of swine from one town to the next, stumbling upon the pass after getting lost in the unmapped woods. It was only when they rambled into the little village of Lynch a week later, scared out of their wits, that the old-timers in town gave it its proper name and told them they'd been lucky to get out at all. He'd tell us the trees themselves whispered in the dark. There were shapes in the woods at night, he'd say, shapes that sang and drummed and danced, but which stayed so wreathed in mist and shadow you'd never know whether what you were seeing was flesh and blood or half-glimpsed illusion. We were never truly sold on the story, but some time after he'd passed, his sister had visited, and had woven a similar yarn about how one of Granddad's eldest brothers had gone back to those woods after a year's ranting about something which dwelt beneath the hills. He had never come home. I tried not to let the others see how much that name unnerved me. If escape were so close, it wouldn't do to trouble them with the place's bad reputation, especially with Keith acting so strangely as it was. I was still certain in those minutes spent digesting the name over the low-burning embers that all this dreary atmosphere and all our frayed minds were born out of the loss of the orphans, of our purpose. I was convinced we were just coming to terms with the humdrum lives that lay ahead of us. Told myself so again and again as I lay down to sleep that night, with my eyes boring into the dark between the trees, reading in every distant twig the malign shape of some gazing geist amidst the branches. I don't know how long I slept, bobbing in and out of troubled, formless dreams all the while. What I do know is that when the quakes came on worse than ever, rattling me awake as they sent dead timber and brittle boulders rumbling down the hills, I was alone in the clearing. Keith and Roger were gone, their rifles, packs, and provisions left to sit in the open without their owners to mind them. Reflexively, I tried to gain my feet, but the trimmers were so stalwart I couldn't help but fall back on my rear. It was only when the shaking retreated that I rose and scanned the still woods for signs of life, the tremors sinking as if drilling deeper into the rock beneath my boots, ever further from the muffled light of the moon through the clouds overhead. It was only then, alone, that I heard the drumming, faint and distorted, echoing up from some far-off holler or ravine. I actually inhaled to call out, to yell for my companions as my isolation began to weigh on me, but I halted just as my mouth began to form the words. I thought better of it. Something stopped me on the brink, a lone animal grinding to a halt as its instincts pleaded for it to follow its herd over a cliff face. There was something off about it all, the landscape itself having taken on the ethereal cast of a nightmare. That constant rhythm, everywhere and nowhere as it bounded off the mountains, like distant thunder protesting the silence of the night. It was then, catching my breath and guessing at where the others might be, that I saw the mist rolling uphill through the trees. Its dull gray pallor was stark against the inky black of the forest, and its speed was anything but natural. It seemed to march like a well-trained phalanx, engulfing tree trunks and scrub like rushing water, silent as death, rising in one unbroken wall from the creek which gurgled lazily along the valley floor below. I didn't need to consider, to plot out my route or question what it was I was seeing. That could wait. In that moment, all I could do was flee. Reaching the far end of the clearing, I flung myself into the tangled brambles and jagged boulders, gritting my teeth against a dozen minor scrapes and scars. Hiding. I lay low, eyes locked on the pale cloud which devoured the clearing, knowing I couldn't outrun it. The drumming swelled, as did the beating of my heart, my eyes wide as a snared rabbit's. I knew not why, but I desperately wished it away, wished that I was anywhere other than the path of that wretched veil of vapor. I held my breath as the mist engulfed my position, and waited. A voice broke through the monotonous drumming, seeming to float across the clearing with a clarity that sank hooks into my mind and kept me still. Roger, I immediately knew, stammering with the terror I hadn't known his sturdy soul was capable of. Again my breath caught in my throat. My lips halted as I made to cry out to him. His form skulked into view through the mist, no more than an ephemeral puppet shivering through the chilled air, but he was not alone. There were a score and more shapes that came on in his wake, crooked and twisted, antlered and horned, silent but always advancing. They came forward as one, gaunt limbs outstretched, their target backpedaling toward our camp as he called my name and found me missing. He took up his rifle, something I say more due to the sound of it being brought to bear than any tangible sight I recall through the terror in the vapor, but he never got to use it. He screamed when they laid hands on him, but he didn't struggle long. There were 100 bobbing heads and rasping silhouettes now, more and more pouring from the trees with each breathless minute onto the open grass, taking up glistening handfuls of flesh and viscera to bear back into the forest where they became one with the night, black as the blackest shadow in the nocturnal hills. I tasted the metallic, wretched slaughter on the wet air, heard their hard-shod feet splash and slide in the blood they'd spilled. Then, when nothing remained in the clearing but the swirling fog and the stink of the freshly dead, it began to recede into the trees, tracing its route back down towards the creek from whence it came. Then the tittering started. From many mouths, scored by that eternal drumming, a coyote-like, growling cackling began at the bottom of the valley. It rose in pitch, some voices chanting words beyond my comprehension, and others braying like goats, their cacophony bounding down Ezra's chasm for miles as they hoisted a hedonistic revelry in the pitch-dark bowels of the mountains. A more terrible noise I've never heard. The screams and crestfallen moans of a blood-soaked field hospital wouldn't hold a candle to it. Then, at least, the cries are sorrowful, pitiful. The shadows in Ezra's chasm were exalted, ecstatic, squealing and roaring with joy which was more animal than any glee a man could summon up. There had been an undercurrent playing itself out in my mind throughout the whole awful ordeal. A stream of consciousness in which I assured myself we'd stumbled into the territory of some surviving band of Shawnee in the deepest parts of the hills. We'd camped in their midst, I desperately thought, and in their vengeful fervor they'd butchered my companions, determined not to be pushed west like so many of their fellows over the course of the last centuries. That tittering cavalcade destroyed my illusions. No warrior of any people could cackle like that. Those were the voices of animals, of monsters, not of men. The night was agonizing. I lay stock still, hesitant even to breathe, ears thrumming with the beating of the drums and the blood-crazed rutting of the things at the creekside. Occasionally I heard groups of heavy feet, hooves, I thought, rumble through the brush, moving up and down the valley between the trees, searching. I was never found out, and it was only when the accursed revelry had halted under the onslaught of the sunrise that I raised my head from the earth and ensured I sat alone. My empty surroundings were no comfort to me. The dark had fled and left a tinted nightmare canvas in its wake. The wood around me was a twisted panoply of reds and sickly pinks. Black veins pulsed in vibrant, swollen trees which had lost their wholesome autumn hues for a uniform, violently bloody scarlet. The scent of iron-tinged slaughter taunted my nostrils, even when the bloodshed in the meadow was far behind me, and my unsteady legs had carried me a mile or more up the chasm through the trees. Always low to the ground, ever vigilant, listening for noises in the forest which only seldom came. The sky overhead was white, leached of color like a severed limb and shot through with streaks and specks of darkest ebony, tears in a heavenly fabric that throbbed and warped in a way which made them agonizing to look upon. When my painfully loud clatter through the brush was occasionally interrupted, it was by whispers, distant as the drumming had been, yet somehow intelligible, etched in smoky finality in the annals of my memory before even I'd heard them spoken. It was the voice of Keith Elder, warm as ever, but solemn as a pastor presiding over one's deathbed. Lurking unseen, he told me from his unseen holdfast in these warped hills that he'd followed music away from camp along a clear stream the day prior to suggesting our fork into Ezra's chasm. There had been a shallow pool far from our camp, his voice told me, an offshoot of the main waterway, the last drippings of the tributary which crept out from the chasm into the hollers beyond. At the base of the pool, writhing like newborn rattlers on the time-smoothed stones, had been the fingers of the mountains. They were alive, these hills, older than the far-off Rockies or the alpine peaks of the Old World. Worn low by countless eons, the weathered spine of Appalachia had grown thin, allowing that which slumbered beneath to breathe life into the open air for the first time since ancient days, when things whose monuments had long fallen to dust bounded beneath the rock and stone. The land was a prison, Keith told me, weaving for hours a tale of slain titans and dark, twisted things from beyond the world we knew. All the while I walked, ran, and stumbled, never once growing further away from that grating voice that whispered in my ear, telling me of the great things which were stirring from their long slumber beneath my feet, reaching with searching tendrils for a reality they'd almost forgotten. I grew more and more desperate as the impossible yarn wove on, heeding the distant drums which began as the noon turned to evening and the sunless white sky overhead began to darken. The valley broke not far ahead, I saw, and a wholesome bluish tinge painted the northward horizon above the trees, the one sane torch to guide my sprint through the forest. I climbed an embankment near the terminus, my desperation making me draw near the awful creek of which Keith whispered as the rocky terrain forced me into a bottleneck at the end of the chasm. It was only when I climbed that steep ridge at the north end of Ezra's chasm, breathless after miles of flight through the alien woodland, that I laid eyes upon my tormentor. The stream gurgled with putrid vigor up through an aperture in the rock, bumbling its way down the hill in slimy rapids, its water now visibly streaked through with dark grime and bloody sinew. Around this aperture there rose a circle of dark stones, etched with foreign runic patterns which seemed to dance in the tepid half-light of the otherworld's sickly dusk. Against one of these pillars leaned a smiling Keith Elder, his head and shoulders oily with water from the creek. Keith told me he would do me no harm, told me he'd come to give me a chance at eternity. If I were to slake my thirst in the stream, I'd see the dreamer beneath the stone, know its every whim, feel its every want. This went deeper than duty, he assured me, deeper than any camaraderie or martial purpose in the war ever had. The dreamer's purpose ran down to the roots of the earth. There would be no dwindling, no stagnant old age, no aimlessness. We would see all, and know how to attain all. Roger had sipped from the waters, he said. He'd seen the children of the thing beneath the hills, and seen its fingers slither up from the stream, and rejected the gift. That is why the dreamer's spawn had taken it. If I resisted the font of the dreamer, I would have nothing to fear from the things which walked the veil behind me. if I knelt and pulled from its waters my purpose, I was bound to that purpose, in life or death. I almost gave in. I saw visions in those moments, witnessed armies of writhing black devils pouring from the wilds of the earth to tear down the rotten husk of a decadent mankind, a horde which put the marches of Tamerlane or Alexander to shame. I was among them, a lieutenant commanding on behalf of a dark mass which laughed beyond the bleached horizon, whose black tendrils raked the sun and cast shadow over the destruction its children wrought. I felt a glory no man has ever felt, and as my heart reached its soaring height, Keith brightened and promised it could last forever. I remembered the tittering, though, the braying bacchanal which followed Roger's slaughter in the meadow. More from wretched impulse than from strength, I turned from the stream and made to pass the stone circle and leave Ezra's chasm behind me. My old companion, more stranger than friend now, bade me stop, bade me look one last time upon the valley, that I might see that which I had chosen to forsake. Keith stepped down into the grimy waters of the stream and pointed out towards the valley floor. His flesh had begun to slough off in streams, like wax poured from an aging candle, and the patchy night-black hide which was revealed beneath seemed to bend and refract the light which touched it. Uneven horns tore through his skull to crown a snouted head. Beyond the crimson canopy, stepping into the gathering gloom of the coming dusk, other similar shapes poured from the trees to the water's edge. The drums began in some distant, forgotten glen, and the ground slowly began to rattle. From the far south, a seam appeared in the glimmering creek, a great tear in the earth which spanned the valley in one great rush. A jagged, thirsting maw I saw, gleaming with the same deathly glow that had tinged the sunless sky above. A foul mist wafted like poison into the open from its depths, rising and falling with the breath of the mountains. The dreamer's kindred danced and laughed, snorted and brayed, threw carrion and themselves into the gnashing mouth with wild abandon. From its stony lips, great tendrils of inky darkness slithered, probing the trees and reaching for the unfamiliar heavens. I stumbled backwards over the crest of the hill, away from the dreamer in the crimson forest and the grunting thing which Keith had become. I know not what took my balance, but I stumbled on the opposite slope and rolled down away from Ezra's chasm. Stumps and stones slowed my descent and shattered several ribs. My rifle, so close a companion after so long in the field, was left strewn on the incline, never to be retrieved. When I crawled onto a dirt path the following morning, babbling and pleading to be taken away from the trees, I fast learned my raving about nocturnal earthquakes and sunless skyscapes was a fast track to the madhouse and held my tongue. The residents saw me off after a week's recovery, and I rode the remainder of the route to Ashland in a cart transporting coal to the mill that flanked the river in town. I'd been lost, I would say, delirious after days without water, my rants a sign of how close to death I'd come. Home proved more relief than I'd imagined, and though my house was threatened with seizure by the avenging state government, the packing of the legislature with orphans in the years to come saved my family from expulsion. A wife and children provide me with ample distraction, and while the somber glory of my days with the orphans will never be eclipsed, I convince myself they serve me well as I plod through an ordinary life, head low and burdens borne humble. Even decades on, though, there's an occasional breeze on autumn nights which draws some whiff of the river to my nose, and bends my tired eyes towards the southern hills. On the darkest of those nights, I feel the urge to return. I recall the chanting of the dreamer's herd on the creek banks, and the pounding of the drums in that misty vale, so much like the booming cadence of a march. As age creeps into my bones, I wonder what vitality could be found in the font of the dreamer. Indeed, I dream of it, walking the miasmic vale with eyes wide and heart full, unafraid in sleep to explore the depths of the place which had so revolted me in waking life. I worry that someday soon by the standards of that timeless dreamer anyway, the cadence will call one final time, that the dreamer's spawn will spill out between the trees into the wider world, that I won't be amongst the phalanx when it springs into motion. Winifred has always had weak lungs, and she's struggled with illness all through the past few winters. I fear she doesn't have many years left, but the children are grown, or almost grown. Perhaps, if I'm still able once she's gone, I'll leave the shop in the hands of my sons and amble off into the hills. Then, when the earth once again trembles beneath the hooves of the kin I forsook in the early autumn of '65, when the dreamer at last reclaims that which is its birthright, my own might march alongside theirs.